leave time for questions, which means we want to take 15 minutes. Now that I understand, along the way I've been various parents of students at St. Stephen's, and now I realize I just met David Sadov's daughter. He's a good friend from the International Development Law Organization. I'm supposed to bust the chops of a guy named Eli Hooper here somewhere. I met his father the other day. There you are, Eli. And I'm sure I have connections to others of you through your parents. I'm just going to try to tell you what I do, why I feel lucky to do it, kind of what's going on in the world of food security, and how you might, in your future, as your futures unfold, be involved in some of the issues that I work on. First of all, let me try to distinguish. It is a mouthful. I am the U.S. ambassador to UN agencies in Rome. A number of my predecessors called themselves a food ambassador. And by the way, George McGovern, who's the great former senator from South Dakota, and I know you're not all Americans, but I know, in fact, only a share of you are Americans, and I'll try to be careful when I make references to the United States, but George McGovern ran for president in 1972 with the objective of stopping the Vietnam War. He was the opponent of Richard Nixon. When he left the Senate, Bill Clinton, who was president, who I worked for in the White House, adored George McGovern, who was a great champion for the world's poor and a great proponent of nutrition, and he sent him to my job. So I'm following the footsteps of George McGovern. As I flew here 2 years ago, I got to meet him at his 90th birthday party, and then he passed away just a few months after. But a number of very interesting Americans have been in my position. They tend to come from backgrounds where they have a little profile and are used to calling attention to issues. And in our case, the set of issues have to do with hunger, agricultural productivity, and improved nutrition. I don't call myself the food ambassador for a couple of reasons. One is there are 6 UN agencies in Rome. 3 of them have to do with food and agriculture, but the other 3, including your father's work at the International Development Law Organization, focus on rule of law and other things that are very important for fighting poverty and development. The other reason I don't say that I'm a food ambassador is for friends of mine who maybe lost touch with what I'm doing. If I tell them I'm living in Rome and I'm a food ambassador, they definitely get the wrong idea. They think I'm focused on great Italian food, and I'm not. I just happen to be here and spend as much time from this platform in Rome visiting the developing world. I was in Jordan just 3 weeks ago visiting Syrian refugees in the refugee camp there. I was in West Africa and Burkina Faso for 8 days in September, looking at how they're building resilience to drought and to many of the other challenges they face in agriculture. And in 2 weeks, I believe, I'll be going to Mozambique to see some of the exciting things smallholder farmers are doing there. I lead a mission of 25 people from the State Department, from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the United States Agency for International Development, which is our poverty-fighting agency. We all work together and represent the U.S. at the 6 different agencies here in Rome. In many ways, I would say the U.S. has a board seat on all of those agencies, and I'm the board member. And because we're the biggest funder, I think, of all of them, tend to have a relevant voice in shaping the direction of the agencies here in Rome. My guess is a number of your parents work at the FAO, IDLO, UNIDWA, ICRAM, the World Food Program, and also, which I'm sure we just left one out, IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development. So feel free to correct me if you know something better than I do as I say it. I also want to indicate that there are 3 American ambassadors in Rome, just so you don't get confused. And a number of countries, I know a good share of you are Italian, some come from other countries, and we all do it differently. But the reason we have 3 is John Phillips, who I believe you heard from recently. He's our ambassador to Italy. He manages that relationship. Ken Hackett is our ambassador to the Holy See, and I am the ambassador to UN agencies. And I often tell people, we are 3. Of course, you're always lucky to be an ambassador, and you're lucky to live in Rome. But in terms of the issues each of us deal with, we're extremely lucky to be here right now. The other 2, I think, are probably obvious to you. To be John Phillips, dealing with Italy at the time that it has a 39-year-old prime minister trying to reinvigorate the country, I think is a really exciting opportunity for him, a very important role for him to play for the United States. Ken Hackett, who spent his life fighting poverty, leading the Catholic Relief Services organization, gets here as Papa Francesco, as Pope Francis takes the stage. You mentioned Bono. Bono's rock star, but I don't think there's a bigger rock star in the world right now than Pope Francis. In my world, why am I lucky to be working on these issues right now? Honestly, the world used to understand the importance of agriculture and investing in agriculture, and somehow we got lazy and we forgot about it, and learned the hard way that we made a mistake. In 2007, 2008, there were massive food price spikes, and there were riots in Haiti and in Africa, and then the rich world, the developed world, kind of woke up and said, what have we missed? And that's when President Obama was coming into office. President Obama is my boss. I worked at the White House for him before being appointed to this position. And he has made food security and the work that we're doing in Rome his highest development priority. Many of you may remember under President Bush, PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, was his top priority, dealing with what he viewed as the biggest challenge of the moment globally, and that was fighting AIDS. It's a very successful program. Even though I'm a Democrat, I worked very closely on behalf of Bill Gates and later on behalf of Obama with President Bush and the Bush administration to support that initiative. And I would say that President Obama's food security initiative has the equivalent significance in his administration. Just a little bit more background on that, and Italy is central to it. So I mentioned these food price spikes. It really is the case that agriculture historically was one of the most important ways that rich countries supported poor countries who were trying to develop themselves. You probably can't think of a country on earth, maybe Singapore, that crossed into a state of high development, industrial development, information economy that didn't pass through a phase of developing its agriculture sector. And in fact, 17% of foreign aid in 1990 went to agriculture. By 2005, that was down to 4%, because people somehow thought that agriculture was no longer a problem. And they thought that because of something called the Green Revolution, which was the use of new technologies and hybrid seeds and fertilizers in countries like Mexico, India, and China, where they dramatically improved agriculture. And those countries which had been dependent on others for their food all of a sudden became self-reliant for food. It was a dramatic change, and I think it allowed people to think that we'd solved hunger and we could move on to other things. But we were wrong. We now know how wrong we were. The Green Revolution never reached Africa or certain other parts of the world. We found out the hard way in 2008 when we had these food price spikes. So President Obama, when he came into office, saw this as the leading challenge, and the next G8 meeting was here in Italy. It was at L'Aquila. I think it was scheduled to be in Rome, but because of the earthquake, they did it in L'Aquila. And the G8 decided that it needed to recommit itself to supporting rural agriculture. And it laid out what are called the Rome Principles for how they would do that. And they committed to spend $22 billion on agriculture in Africa over the next few years. The U.S. share of that was $3.5 billion, and it's been exceeded. In fact, I will say this, the G8 doesn't always keep its promises. That was one of the things that Bono used to try to hold them account for, is the various promises they made. But in fact, in agriculture, they exceeded the promise. And so, all that is to say that in many ways, we're experiencing a renaissance and a reawakening on agriculture, and we better not blow it the second time, because I think we won't have too many more chances. Why focus on agriculture? Well, the World Bank has said that investing in agricultural development has 2.5 times more impact in terms of contributing to prosperity than investing in other sectors. And frankly, in sub-Saharan Africa, it's 11 times more, so it's critically important. It's also the case that probably 40% of the farmers in the world, agriculture workers, are women. In Africa, it's 50%, it's half, and in some parts of Africa, it's 80%. So, and we all know, I think you may know, that when women earn greater income, it frankly has a better impact on the lives of their families, because they're much more inclined to put that money into the care of their children, into their education, into feeding their families. So a couple other statistics that may interest you. 7% of the world's poor live in rural areas, and 86% of them work in agriculture. So it's generally thought that if we can do something to transform rural agriculture, we can impact poverty in a really substantial way. That's what we're trying to do with Feed the Future. That's what I'm trying to do in Rome, representing the United States and the different food agencies. By the way, the 50% of farmers in Africa who are women produce 1/3 less than their male counterparts, and it's not because they work less hard. It's because they have fewer access to good seeds and to tools and to fertilizer and to finance and all the things that are important for being successful farmers. And it's been estimated that if women had the same access to these inputs to make them successful farmers, we could feed 150 million more people on the planet every year. And that's one reason that President Obama has made a focus on women farmers and smallholder farmers, the center of the Feed the Future program. So I'm going to now just focus a little bit on good news. And the bad news is there's still 805 million people in the world. It's roughly 1 in 8, 1 in 9, who are food insecure, which is to say they don't know the next day how they're going to feed their families. And I've experienced this myself. Literally, I went door to door in Cambodia in December and asked mothers what the plan was for food the next day. And they would say they didn't know. They thought they might go see a cousin who had some rice or something like that. It's hard to imagine sitting here in Rome, but food insecurity is very, very real. And it afflicts basically 805 million people out of roughly 7 billion in the world. And 1 in 4 children, that's 200 million, are undernourished. So the challenges are great, but I'm hoping to give you reasons for optimism. There's a lot of very exciting, positive, transformative work going on. I just want to describe it briefly. And let me start with advocacy, because I spent 10 years working for Bill Gates. I ran his office in Washington, focused on using his voice and his wife's voice to try to improve public policy. And then I spent 3.5 years running Bono's organization, the One Campaign, which has 4 million members. You ought to log in. One.org when you're done to see how you might get involved. I'm now just a fan, I'm no longer part of the organization. But one of the things we used to do is try to figure out how to persuade the American public to be more supportive of foreign aid, of doing more. I think Italy's been a quite generous country over the years. The U.S. is generous with food aid, but we could be doing much more. And we would do focus groups where you'd interview regular citizens. I remember doing it in Philadelphia, in London, and in Atlanta, and you'd ask people what would make them more willing to support their government doing more for poor countries. And on their own, people would say, what's that? They think it's from the Bible, but it's not. It's Confucian saying, what's that statement? Give a man a fish, feed him for a day, teach a man to fish, feed him for a lifetime. Well, that, in fact, is what people say. If that's what we were doing, I'd support doing that more, which is very good news for advocates. It means if people only believe that foreign aid can change people's lives instead of just applying a Band-Aid, they would be much more willing to support it, which in fact is what Feed the Future and a lot of this work is doing. And let me give you then the kind of bad news part. Launching Feed the Future was meant to get us away from dependency of providing food aid and getting to a world where poor smallholder farmers, women farmers, can provide enough food for their families, and then also income to send their kids to school and do all the other things they want to do. And that is actually working. By the way, that's largely the work of the FAO, trying to transform agriculture, and IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development. The World Food Program, which is one of the greatest agencies in the world, one of the most effective. Frankly, if you tell your parents who work there, I said this, they might squirm a little bit, but they're more in the nature of giving a man a fish, and it's what we need them to do. It's what we need them to do because people are starving, and we have a moral imperative that people are starving to keep them fed. And we don't really have the luxury to always focus on long-term transformation. The good news is at FAO and IFAD, those agencies are doing amazing work transforming the lives of the rural poor. And we want to get to a world where the WFP is a less important part of the equation. But unfortunately, the world isn't really cooperating. Those who follow the WFP may know that they have something called a level 3 emergency, which is when problem is so severe that the local country effort isn't sufficient to address it, that the regional effort isn't sufficient to address it. They need the whole headquarters to be galvanized to address the problem. They've never had more than 2 at a time, and right now they have 5. And that's because the world is in a very disruptive state. So the 5 are Syria, where we're spending $40 million a week to keep refugees alive. Iraq, where things are coming undone. Central African Republic, where there's a huge conflict. South Sudan, where there's another huge conflict because of the failure of governance. And Ebola, where food is not moving and farmers are unable to plant because the societies in West Africa have been frozen up. So that's an important aspect. The emergencies are something that aren't going to go away, but we need to focus on good governance and responsible leadership in those countries in order to minimize those. But meanwhile, we are making enormous progress on the transformative side. And I mentioned the $805 million. I should have mentioned that last year was $842 million were food insecure. That's a dramatic improvement that was announced by the FAO just a few weeks ago. The other thing that's very positive, where's the FAO? Is it right there? Somehow it's around the corner. So if you saw a lot of activity last week and on the big banners at the FAO, you saw there was a big focus on nutrition. Feed the Future, a lot of these other initiatives were focused on helping farmers produce more, and we may have underweighted the importance of nutrition. So it's not just enough to produce more food and produce more calories. It's critical that the content of food helps provide the energy and the nourishment, especially the children need to develop. By the way, there's something called the 1,000 Days Partnership, which was launched by Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State. And the 1,000 days refers to the 9 months of pregnancy and then the 2 years that follow a child being born. And we now know in a clearer way than we've ever known before that those 1,000 days are really critical, and there are no do-overs. If you have bad nutrition when you're 1 year old, your brain will be constrained and hindered as you go forward. And if you get good nutrition at age 3 and age 4, you really can't make up for that loss. So there's an awareness now that nutrition, especially for young children, is critically important. And that's the other part of it. That's the other bit of good news. Last week, there was the International Conference on Nutrition. The last time we had one was 22 years ago. The Pope came and spoke. Melinda Gates was here. That's Bill Gates' wife, who leads the Gates Foundation, also to speak about it. There's an awakening with respect to nutrition, and again, dramatic progress being made there. So it's all very positive. I see my time is up, and what I think I want to do is simply say a little bit about how you all, how I think you can fit in. First of all, was Alice Waters here speaking to this group? Or was...
We spoke to Alice.
Oh, you spoke. So, I think, I really come from an advocacy background where we're trying to persuade people to get their governments to do more, but also to do more on their own. And it's important that people understand that in the face of all the relentless negative information that we get, there is actually dramatic progress being made in the world, and the level of innovation that's possible is greater than ever before. That's one of the reasons Bono is such an effective advocate, is he's a great communicator. He's always eager to tell people the success of what they have done, especially with respect to AIDS and malaria and some of these other things. And I think if you follow the press, you don't always get a picture that's not always clear, in the picture. But as you grow up, as you leave high school and go to college, you're gonna, the framework we applied when I first got into development and advocacy was unfortunately one of the North, the rich world, helping the South, providing aid, providing knowledge, providing leadership, but sometimes in a way that didn't listen to Southern voices. And I think there's been an absolute revolution and transformation. Last time I went to Africa with Bono, he was talking to 1,000 college students at the University of Prague and said, I now realize the organization I created called One should have been called One Half, because it was all kids and others in the North, in the rich world, speaking for people and on behalf of people in the poor world, but it really didn't have the voices of people in the poor world. One of the things I did before I left that organization is we created offices in Johannesburg and Abuja, and really launched an initiative to bring Southern voices, voices of the poor world, of the developing world, into the equation. And now, I mean, that's pretty pervasive in everything that happens in development. If you look at Feed the Future and the Rome Principles, which were announced here, as I said, in 2009, principle number one is country ownership. It's the poor countries themselves need to set the direction. We're here to help them, and we're here to support them. And that's a sea change in the sort of mentality. And it's much more respectful, and I think it's extremely important. And the world that you guys are going to live in, if you choose to be involved in these kinds of issues, is going to be one where, through social media and everything, you're going to be talking to citizens in Zimbabwe or Burkina Faso and understanding what it is that matters to them. And you're going to be much more part of a sort of shared community in addressing global problems. And also, I would say there's so many more ways to go at this. In the past, the ways we tried to attack poverty was either through charity or through government programs. And now, let me just state the biggest equation we face in food security. And you can imagine all the innovation and all the opportunities to participate in this from the private sector. By the year 2050, we need to be able to feed 9 billion people, not just the 7 billion who live on the planet now, more nutritious food, because we understand nutrition better, with fewer inputs, that's less water, less fertilizer, on probably the same or less land, and in the face of climate change. On the one hand, that's very daunting. On the other hand, for those of you who are going to be engineers or do other kinds of things, imagine the innovation that's going to be required and it's going to help transform the world in each of those categories. And the innovation is taking place all the time right now. It's extremely positive. There's a lot of things we know. We know more than we've ever known before. We're able to have global conversations the way we've never had them before, that respect the poor people, the poor of the world, and look to them for their leadership. And we have more of a complete approach to these things. It does involve the philanthropic sector, does involve the government sector, but also involves the private sector, all coming together to address these things. The last thing I'll tell you, you can Google this. In 2000, you may know or you may not know. If you don't know, I urge you to look it up. The world launched the Millennium Development Goals. I was working for Bill Gates at the time. He was very skeptical. Come on, the UN is going to launch a set of anti-poverty goals, and we really think that's going to make a difference. The Bush administration was skeptical as well. They both came around and realized they were wrong. That in fact, if you state a goal and you say you're going to organize around it, and you say you're going to measure progress rigorously against it, you can make dramatic progress. So we set of goals announced in 2000 at the Millennium Summit at the UN. They expire in 2015. It's a big deal. We've made enormous progress on AIDS and on malaria. We're going to exceed some of these targets. On hunger, the goal was that to reduce by half the absolute number of people who are hungry, and we're going to come darn close. We're going to probably barely miss it, but we're going to be very, very close. And I think there's an incredibly positive lesson from this process about what happens when there's political will and we galvanize it and address certain problems. So what's happening right now, and what's been happening for the last year or so, but will culminate in September of next year, is the next wave of goals called the Sustainable Development Goals are being negotiated at the UN. They're going to include a lot of new things, including nutrition, including a measurement of stunting, and probably food waste, some of the things that are very important. And I would urge you all, for the next 15 years that follow that, those who care about poverty in the world are going to be animated by that. They're going to be focused on that. They're going to be using that as their scorecard for how we're doing. And as you all become adults and move into whatever aspect of society, whatever profession you choose to move into, I hope you'll be aware of those, and I hope you find a way to help the world address those challenges, because I think we're going to be making enormous progress in the next 10 or 15 years. I way exceeded my time. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions.
You mentioned before the 5 main problems for food in the world today, but what about the Palestinian and
Yes. Yes. Again, through the World Food Program primarily, the U.S. provides 42% of the World Food Program's budget, or at least that's what it was last year. And we're addressing the West Bank and Gaza dislocations through our contribution to the World Food Program, which is feeding those people. But again, it's so frustrating when all the best efforts are just keeping people alive and trying to maintain stability. And I think almost implied in your question is that their answer is in agriculture. I mean, I'm sure there's some agricultural things they could do in that part of the world. Right now, it's a Band-Aid. We're providing food that keeps people alive. The answer is in political solutions, as in most of those areas that I described, the level 3 emergencies. But yes, there's a lot going on there to feed refugees and dislocated, what they sometimes call internally displaced persons.
So you mentioned the ICN2, the International Conference on Nutrition.
Yeah.
But I heard that last time the ICN came to
22 years ago, yeah.
There were 22 to 32 delegates from across the world. This year I heard there were only 8, including plus.
You know, it could be that moment was more of a crisis moment in trying to galvanize world attention. I don't know that I would make that the metric for success. A lot of the Queen of Spain was here, the King of Swaziland, I think, was here. But I honestly, as someone who has occasionally dealt with heads of state, I know it lends a certain luster to it, but in terms of the practical work that needs to be done going forward, I think this was a success. It's also worth noting how the world has changed in 22 years. 22 years ago, it was important to actually be in a place because of the way communications worked 30 and 40 years ago. And now, you could almost have a virtual ICN2. Coming to Rome is not necessarily the measure of success. I think it'd be worth looking at the outcome documents, and I would particularly, of course I want you to read the U.S. statement put forward by our delegate, but I would urge you to read the Pope's statement as well, which is very, very powerful, and I think shook up the room.